Hi everyone, thank you for joining this session. Today I'll be talking about cost effectiveness thresholds. In particular, I'll be discussing some of the issues around using evidence to inform a threshold to be used in policy. This review work has been conducted over a couple of years, and as you can see, I've been in very good company. This work was funded by the ABPI, who I hope they won't mind me saying they gave us free rein to dig into this topic with a view to helping the policy world make some sense of what is a very complex area of research. So our starting point was essentially the acknowledgement that for more and more countries, researchers are publishing estimates of opportunity cost, or what are commonly known as supply-side thresholds. The obvious question that arises is how should policymakers make use of this evidence in adopting or changing a cost-effectiveness threshold for use in policy. So after spending a lot of time thinking about this, our ideas started to coalesce around a series of questions, which you can see here. Today I'll focus on a discussion of those three questions that really get to the heart of how policymakers might use evidence on thresholds. To do this, I'll take you through three steps. First, we'll have a look at what it actually means to use evidence in the context of cost-effectiveness thresholds. Second, we'll have a look at the evidence base as it currently stands, and we'll talk about some of its limitations in relation to theory, the methods and the data that underlie available estimates. And third, I'll outline our recommendations for what policymakers can do to use this evidence in a productive way. But before I get into that, it's probably worth me providing an extra bit of background. This is a really confusing area of research, even for those of us who are quite familiar with it, and the policy implications are huge. Essentially, what we're talking about is research that attempts to identify how much it currently costs to create an extra unit of health within the health service. Then, if a new technology creates extra units of health at a higher cost than this, then in principle, if we have a fixed budget, its adoption would have an overall negative impact on population health. This is because it would displace something more cost effective. So that's why we have the idea of a threshold. Now, the research studies in question attempt to identify that number by looking at associations between health expenditures and health outcomes. But when we look at this, we see that actually things are even more complicated than many researchers have let on. So I'd encourage you to go and see our poster on this issue at this conference. So as I mentioned, there are estimates available for an increasing number of countries. These estimates have had some impact on policy. But generally speaking, this has been quite limited so far. I would speculate that this is partly because we haven't seen a nuanced consideration of the policy implications of this evidence as a whole. So how can thresholds be evidence-based? I think it's important to start by noting that a threshold isn't the same thing to everybody. Policymakers can set thresholds. Decision makers have to make decisions in relation to that threshold, and researchers can argue about what they think the optimal threshold would be. But the most important distinction is that a policy threshold is not synonymous with empirical estimates of opportunity cost. If you assume that they're the same thing, then you're adopting some quite major normative assumptions. Part of the reason that defining evidence-based thresholds is so difficult is that there really is no analogy in public policy. We're talking about using a precise number to guide decision making, and that number is a function of past decisions. There's a kind of inherent circularity. Something which hasn't been given the consideration that I think it deserves is that there are different ways of using evidence in policy. In some senses, the ideal scenario is that policymakers could make instrumental use of the evidence and explicitly define thresholds with reference to that evidence. But it seems obvious to state that there should be some evidentiary requirements for this. You'd want robust and validated estimates if you were going to use them directly in policy. The fact is, we'll never have a perfect estimate of opportunity costs for any health service. There are simply too many moving parts. So in this scenario, it may be more reasonable to make conceptual use of the evidence such that you're not heavily reliant on it being correct in order to make sensible decisions. So with the notion of evidentiary requirements in mind, we dug into the research. We figured that for the evidence to be used in policy, the theory, the methods, and the data used should be clear and robust. So these are the issues that we considered. So considering the theory underlying these studies, we see that there's inconsistency in how researchers define the metric that they're seeking to identify. And here's another good opportunity for me to plug our poster in which we try to set some of these out. A consistent issue is the reliance on averages. There's little consideration of what it actually means for policy to support the correct decision on average. We see that opportunity costs are not fixed across decisions or across geographies or through time, so the theoretical basis of a single estimate becomes somewhat clouded. Another issue with studies identifying a single number is that we see policymakers using ranges, such as NICE's £20,000 to £30,000 threshold. It's not clear how a single estimate can be theoretically consistent with the use of a range. But perhaps the biggest issue is that these estimates are inherently political in a way that researchers haven't really recognised. They assume a certain objective for public healthcare funding overall, one that's probably not realistic, namely that the health service seeks to maximise QALYs. If we accept that decision makers don't simply seek to maximise QALYs, then what we have, even in theory, is not representative of opportunity costs, even on average. All right, onto methodology. The key thing here is that it's really difficult to identify causality. That's mainly because health expenditures influence health outcomes, which influence health expenditure. Essentially, we would expect there to be very little variation in health expenditure that is not in some way related to health outcomes. This is perhaps why current evidence is based almost solely on static models that look at variation across locations rather than changes over time. But what little evidence we do have suggests that these dynamic processes are important, and the static models may be significantly biased. Heterogeneity is another important issue that's been under-researched. Opportunity costs will vary across clinical and geographical contexts, and there's no consensus on how the heterogeneity ought to be accounted for in the estimate of a single threshold. In general, there's been very little investigation into the appropriateness of the methods used, and few comparisons between alternative model specifications and assumptions. Finally, in terms of data, there will of course always be limitations in the data, and researchers just have to do the best they can with what they've got. One thing we can say is that there's likely to be a trade-off according to the level of aggregation in the data. It's not easy to reconcile observations from the individual patient level right up to national expenditure decisions. As I mentioned, the theoretical basis for estimating thresholds in this way relies on the idea that the health service seeks to maximise QALYs, and yet in general studies aren't able to observe estimates of QALYs and instead rely on mortality data. But the biggest lack of data is on actual opportunity costs. We simply don't know what is displaced when something new is funded. This means that it's currently not possible to validate estimates against what's actually happening in the health service. All right, so we know that the evidence has some limitations and that it probably always will. So what should policymakers do? We have 4 recommendations. The first is that policymakers should define the scope of the decisions to which a threshold will be applied. To date, this has essentially been defined by researchers, but this is not something that researchers ought to decide. Key questions here can help to define the relevant budget constraint, whether there's a single objective, such as maximising QALYs, or there could be multiple objectives. It's important to specify to which technologies a threshold will be applied. Is it only new medicines or some other subset of technologies? And there are different types of decisions that a threshold may inform, from price negotiations to clinical guidelines. This is all relevant to how empirical studies to identify threshold estimates should be designed. Our second recommendation is the biggest and most important. Policymakers should develop a clear process for assessing evidence for use in setting thresholds. This process should adopt characteristics that we're kind of familiar with. It should be systematic in identifying all of the evidence. It should assess the quality of that evidence. The terms of the assessment should be predefined, and it should include all relevant stakeholders. The process should address a series of questions relating to the theory and the methods and the data underlying the evidence. And perhaps most importantly, it should consider how the evidence ought to be used to inform policy, if at all. Our third recommendation is in recognition of the fact that there will always be limitations in empirical threshold estimates, and that therefore a mechanistic application of estimates is never likely to be the best approach. Policymakers should maintain flexibility in the use of evidence-based thresholds. Here I've listed some of the key ways in which flexibility should be maintained. Finally, policymakers who are setting thresholds need to support local decision makers who are kind of subject to thresholds. This will help ensure that thresholds inform decisions as is intended and in line with the manner in which they've been estimated. So we've covered a lot of ground there. I hope you'll be interested in reading our full paper once it's published. These are the key messages that I'd like you to take away from my talk. Researchers have been conducting some groundbreaking work in this context, and it's really important that the resulting evidence is considered in the policymaking process. But it's equally important that policymakers don't simply take these numbers and accept them at face value as if they represent opportunity costs. The only way to achieve a truly evidence-based approach to setting cost-effectiveness thresholds is to establish a robust process for the assessment of evidence, which is surely something that comes quite naturally to the HTAi community. Thank you.